When we examine the aftermath of empire, we tend to focus on borders, language, and national identity. When we discuss nature, we picture pristine, untouched wilderness. Rarely do these two conversations meet. For decades, critics studying the fallout of colonialism have suffered from spatial amnesia, treating the natural world as a passive stage where the human drama of history simply unfolds. But the environment is actively shaped by human power. Thinkers who built the foundation for studying marginalized voices, like Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, have expanded their vocabulary to account for the planetary scale. Environmental activists like Vandana Shiva argue that colonialism and the destruction of global ecological diversity are two faces of the same historical process. Imperialism required a massive, unconsented reorganization of entire global ecosystems. Rishabh Shetty's 2022 film Kantara visualizes these abstract arguments through the lens of a regional action drama. The narrative anchors itself on a single conflict over the forest of coastal Karnataka, pitting land held as a sacred trust against land viewed as extractable property. This three-way collision over sovereignty involves the secular bureaucratic state, a compromised local elite backed by capital, and a subaltern community bound by ritual. The friction between these three specific actors reveals how colonial ecological violence continues into the present day. The subaltern community's claim originates in a founding covenant from 1847. A spiritually restless king makes a pact with a forest deity and the indigenous villagers who worship it. This pact dictates that the land exists in trust, bound by a web of reciprocal obligations between the ruler, the deity, and the people. The Bhoota Kola operates as a rigorous system of indigenous knowledge, governing the community's legal and ecological affairs. In this system, nature possesses explicit agency, moral authority, and the legal power to adjudicate land disputes. This relational understanding of ecology stands in opposition to the rigid property laws that European empires used to categorize and exploit the globe. Replacing a living covenant with a written property deed is an act of epistemic violence designed to erase indigenous authority. In the film's present day, that authority faces a threat from the landlord, Devendra. Frantz Fanon warned that a local post-colonial bourgeoisie often steps into the power vacuum left by a departing empire. Devendra performs cultural rituals to claim belonging, while weaponizing the colonial-derived court system to dispossess his own neighbors. This photograph of felled timber on an industrial scale captures the economic engine driving Devendra's betrayal, the demand for resource extraction. Formal decolonization simply transferred the deeds to a local comprador class who continued the patterns of extractive violence. The final node is the secular state, arriving with a mandate to nationalize the forest. This image documents a British administrator mapping territory. The modern state forestry department inherited these tools from this colonial administration, where surveying was an explicit instrument of imperial control. These measurements operate on a single logic. Without a formal paper deed, the people living there are legally invisible. Armed forest officers patrolling undeeded tribal land today represent the same assumption. The state treats this geography as a repository of resources waiting for official management. Rhetoric regarding conservation often provides a sanitized cover for bureaucratic reorganization that criminalizes the original inhabitants of the forest. These three forces collide at the film's climax. The written property deed shatters against the living testimony of the Bhoota Kola performer. The state forest officer shifts his position, eventually aligning with the indigenous resistance. This is an epistemic conversion, where the state's representative acknowledges a form of authority that predates his own laws. The post-colonial fault line rests between those who see land as extractable property and those who honor it as a sovereign covenant. This critique targets the Western obsession with preserving pristine wilderness. This image shows the ordered rows of a tea plantation. The idea of untouched nature is a myth that ignores the violent displacement of the indigenous groups who shaped those landscapes for millennia. These green spaces are often architectures of colonial extraction. Kantara's forest is saturated with historical sediment. Every boundary line carries memory and the scars of political contestation. Treating nature as a neutral, ahistorical backdrop prevents us from seeing the power dynamics driving modern ecological destruction. This local conflict reflects the dynamics of the globalized climate crisis, where international development schemes often replicate the state officer's initial mandate. Nations that industrialized through centuries of extraction now author the frameworks for global green solutions. Modern mechanisms like carbon markets and biodiversity offsets frequently repeat the colonial gesture. They propose bureaucratic reorganization of global South land while bypassing the claims and knowledge of the communities living there. Planetary ecological crises cannot be solved by applying more layers of bureaucratic administration to marginalized lands. True ecological survival requires dismantling spatial amnesia. It demands recognizing the authority of subaltern communities and accepting that the forest can render its own judgment.